Hello, welcome back to Planet 40k. In today's video, we're going to be discussing, are the Catan powers overrated? So we're going to be going through all the powers, and we're also going to be rating those Catan powers. So we're going to be bringing back the old rating system, so you OG subscribers will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a 5-star rating. We used to do it on the channel many years ago, so we're going to be bringing that back and see how it goes. Got a little bit of bookkeeping to do before we get into the video today. First of all, I wanted to shout out Cordero R, who's rejoined our members area. One of our warlords has returned, so shout out to you, Cordero, otherwise known as Capo X in the Discord. Now, speaking of the Discord, here are some of the channels we've got, and as you can see right at the top, we've got a video ideas section. Now, somebody quite recently put a video suggestion, and that was the Scorpec Lord, and he simply put, well, why don't you try to make a Power of the Catan tier list? Now, we're not going to be doing a tier list today, but it is kind of similar, so we are going to be talking about the good and the bad of each of the Catan powers. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. So first of all, we're going to go through the 6 generic powers that are in the Necron Codex that are available to all the Catan shards. Now, in fact, I should mention today, we're not really discussing the Tesseract Bolt. Now, of course, the Tesseract Bolt does a lot more to each of those powers, whether it makes them more powerful or just easier to achieve. We're mainly going to be talking about the 3 named Catan shards, as well as the Transcendent Catan shard. So the first one, which is Antimatter Meteor, which is personally one of my favourite out of the 6 generic options. You roll a d6, on a result of a 3, a 4 or a 5, the closest enemy unit within 24 inches and visible will suffer 3 mortal wounds, and on a 6, the enemy unit will suffer d3 plus 3 mortal wounds. So let's talk about that for a moment and break that down. So first of all, it's got a decent range. Out of all the Catan powers, it's got the longest range of 24 inches. That makes it really usable. Right from turn 1, you're going to be smashing this out in the movement phase. Second of all, it's a flat 3 mortal wounds, which is pretty good. There's no d3 here, and maybe you're rolling a 1 or a 2 and only scoring 1 mortal wound. It is just a straight 3 mortal wounds, no ifs, no buts. And you've even got the chance of doing d3 plus 3 if you do roll that 6. Now, unfortunately, you've got to also take into consideration the negatives when selecting Antimatter Meteor. The first one is it fails 1/3 of the time. Bear in mind, you will need to roll a 3 plus for this to go off, so a 1 or a 2 is an instant fail. You're going to be doing no damage. So it is a little bit of a risk reward kind of system here, but I do like the fact that it's quite a long range. So even if you did miss it on the first turn, it's not the be all and end all, because some of the other powers aren't even within range in that first turn anyway. Now, the last negative point to mention here is the target must be visible. Now, this is a huge problem for Catan shards in general, because especially for the Nightbringer, as you can see in the image, when you're flying up the board with your Catan shards such as the Nightbringer, you want to be hiding behind obscuring terrain. You don't want to be losing 3 wounds in the shooting phase, especially if it's already taken damage in the psychic phase as well, because you could actually lose your Nightbringer in one single turn. So ideally, you want to be behind obscuring terrain for that first turn, maybe even the second turn, until you can get into close proximity to actually make that charge. Now, the problem there is that if you're not visible, then also your opponent is not going to be visible. So unless you're sticking your toe out and allowing himself to be visible, then he's not actually going to be able to see other units. Don't get me wrong, you could target a melee based kind of unit that you know isn't going to be able to get you that round. That works perfectly fine, but if it is a shooter unit, yeah, you may be asking for trouble just by sticking a toenail out. So you just got to bear that one in mind when using Antimatter Meteor. So let's bring the rating system in today for the first time in the video. For me, I really like this power, to be honest with you. I take it virtually every time I take a Nightbringer. Now, I do tend to change up my Catan power as the game goes on when I get into closer range. But at the start, I definitely start with Antimatter Meteor. And for today's video, I'm going to be giving it a 3.5 out of 5 star. Taking away a 1.5 stars simply because you've got to be visible, but the major flaw is the fact that you've actually got a 1/3 of a chance of actually failing it. And don't forget, guys, that there's no rerolls here. On to the second one, which is Time's Arrow. So you're selecting one enemy unit within 18 inches and visible to your Catan shard. You roll a d6. If the total equals or exceeds the wounds characteristics of any models in that enemy unit, your opponent selects one of those models in that unit to be destroyed. So let's talk about that for a second. So it's a mid-range Catan power, 18-inch range. That's not too bad. It's obviously not 24-inch range, so you will need to move first turn. Of course, your opponent may actually deploy all their units pretty far back, so this may not even be in range from turn 1 or even turn 2 in fact. And don't forget, guys, if you are advancing your Catan shard, you can't be doing any of your Catan powers. So the second point here is it's got a good chance of removing an elite model. Just take, for example, a Terminator model, and Terminators, as you know, have 3 wounds. So if you simply roll a 3 plus, then yeah, one of those Terminators is simply destroyed. I mean, you can even take that further, going up against, say, an Apothecary. They've only got 4 wounds, so on a 4 plus, you would literally remove an Apothecary from play there. so you could actually even be sniping out character models. Now in terms of the negative points for times arrow, so it obviously can't be used against any models that have got 7+ wounds, because obviously the maximum you can actually roll is a 6, so you're not going to equal or exceed the wounds characteristics of any of those models. Now the target again must be visible, so that brings us back to that obscuring terrain problem. You want to be hiding your Catan shards. If they're sticking their chin out, you may need to expect some firepower coming your way, and you might be losing 3 wounds in that phase. And finally, it's not really that useful against horde units, because you're only going to be eliminating one single model from that actual unit. So eliminating an 8-point Orc Boy, yeah, it's not really worth it in terms of Catan Shard power, is it? But that being said, I do quite like the fact that you can snipe off a character or snipe off some of those elite models that have got around 3 to 4 wounds. That's what your target kind of should be. Now don't get me wrong, that is very situational. You're not always going to play against those kind of models, but when you do, I think it's really powerful. So I'm going to be giving this one a 3.5 stars. Now next, speaking of stars, is Sky of Falling Stars. So this time you're selecting up to 3 enemy units within 24 inches of your Catan Shard. For each of those units you roll a d6 on a 1, 2, 3, 4 or a 5. If the result is less than the number of models in the unit will suffer d3 mortal wounds. So this one's got a good range of 24 inches again, like the first one, Antimatter Meteor. Very nice to be using this nice and early. You've got the chance of doing 3 mortal wounds on 3 completely different targets. That's pretty good. And this one does not require visibility. It's coming from the sky itself. Don't need to be visible whatsoever, so you can actually hide your Catan Shard behind obscuring terrain and still be using this perfectly fine. Also, even if your opponent is hiding behind their obscuring terrain, they're not going to benefit from that whatsoever. Now as for the bad points, you instantly fail on a roll of a 6. Okay, that is only a 1 in 6 chance, but you've got to mention it. It's going to have a higher difficulty versus smaller units. So the smaller the unit is, the less chance of you actually achieving any damage on the actual unit itself. If the unit's got only 3 models, then you need to roll a 1, a 2 or a 3 to be successful. Which actually means if you're going up against single model units such as single vehicles, say like a Dreadnought for example, it's going to have absolutely no use whatsoever because you can't roll less than a 1. So even if you did roll a 1, it's not going to do anything because you've not rolled less than the amount of models in that unit. So with all that being said, this is another strong one. I know a lot of you guys actually quite like this one. I seem to see this one in the comments quite often, but for me this is a 3.5 star again. It really was pushing 4 stars to be honest with you. Just from my experiences alone, every time I use this, I just don't seem to have a good enough target for it. Maybe it's just the people I'm playing against, I don't know. I remember in my last game, in fact, playing against Darren from Twisted Dice at Idic Beer's tournament, and yeah, there was virtually just Rhinos and Demon Princes available, and yeah, this power wasn't going to do anything to those. So let's move on to number 4, which is the Cosmic Fire. So you roll 1d6 for each enemy unit within 9 inches of your Catan Shard. On a 4+, the unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. So this one has absolutely no limit to how many units can actually take damage. Whatever you can fit into that 9-inch radius from your Catan Shard can be selected as a target for the Cosmic Fire. And that also can include character models. There's no Lookout Sir with this because this isn't a shooting attack. So anything you can net within your 9-inch radius is going to be taking some damage. So if you do manage to get your Catan Shard in and amongst a lot of units, then yeah, this is really powerful. Now the last point, it doesn't actually require any visibility again, but to be honest with you, it is only 9 inches, so you're quite likely to be out in the open at that stage anyway. So speaking of the 9 inches, that is only a small radius. You're not going to be using this in the first few turns, unless you're getting absolutely outrun by some Orc Speed Freaks for example, or maybe some Tyranid Gene Sealers have pounced on your guys. But other than that, you're not really going to get to use this early in the game, so I wouldn't recommend taking this to start the game off, but you do have the opportunity to change your Catan power to this if needed. Now it's not that useful against low model count factions. If you're going up against say Custodes for example, there's not that many units on the actual battlefield and they're not going to be that close together because they need to obviously be scoring objective points, secondary objectives and things like that, so you're not likely to catch a lot of units in that 9-inch bubble. Then finally, even if you do catch a unit in that 9-inch bubble, it's a 50-50 on whether you're actually going to be doing any damage whatsoever because it's a 4+ roll. Even if you get 2 units caught in the net, you may roll a 1 and a 3 and you're not going to do any damage whatsoever. So for me, another situational one, it does require you to get quite close. It's not one that I take, but it is something that I tend to change up during the game. But for today, I'm going to be giving it a 2.5 star. On to number 5, Seismic Assault. You select one enemy unit within 18 inches and visible to the Catan Shard. You roll 1d6 for each model in the unit, and on a 6, the unit will suffer 1 mortal wound to a maximum of 10 mortal wounds. So it's another mid-range Catan power, 18-inch range, not too bad at all, and it's very good against large units. Now in fact, if you've got a unit of 18 models, that's going to be an average of 3 mortal wounds, because of course you need a 6, For every 6 dice, you should on average get 1 6. If you've got 18 of them, that's 3. Basic maths there. However, this will require visibility, so back to square one with those problems of visibility and obscuring terrain. It's also not useful against most units really. Now don't get me wrong, those horde units do come up in games, but even if you do come up against that kind of unit, you're only really going to be removing 2 to 3 weak models from that unit. So it kind of makes you think, well, why don't I just take one of the other powers? You can do that same sort of damage output, and you can also have the opportunity to go against elite units as well as those horde units. So for me, it's not really one of my favoured ones. Okay, it is a little bit more of a guarantee, if you like, in terms of averages anyway, as it has nothing to guarantee with dice, of course. But I would just take one of the other powers to have a little bit more flexibility with who I'm going up against. But for Seismic Assault, I'm going to be giving it a 2 out of 5 star. Onto the 6th generic Catan power today, and we've got the Transdimensional Thunderbolt. Not one that I personally ever take, to be honest with you, but let's go through it anyway. So you're selecting one enemy unit within 24 inches and visible to your Catan shard. You roll a d6 on a 2+, that unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. So far so good. Then you roll a d6 for each other enemy unit within 3 inches of that first selected unit. Then on a 4+, that unit suffers a mortal wound. So it's got a good range of 24 inches, that's what we like to see. And you've got a chance of doing additional mortal wounds to other units. Now there's no limit to that either. If there's like 5 or 6 units that are within 3 inches of the selected unit, happy days, you're going to be doing quite a lot of mortal wounds. So ideally you want to be targeting a large unit with a large footprint, because yeah, you've got more chance of getting units within 3 inches of it. And then lastly, it's quite easy to do because you just simply need to roll a 2+. Only 1/6 of a chance of actually failing the roll. Now, it requires visibility again. We've already mentioned that previously a few times now in this video. And characters under 9 wounds are protected. It's kind of a mini lookout sir, if you like. But that doesn't stop you from actually targeting the unit that's within 3 inches of the character and then throwing one single mortal wound at the actual character on a 4+. Just bear that one in mind too. Now, the additional mortal wounds are only within 3 inches. And it's also a 50-50 roll, so you're not likely going to have a lot of units within 3 inches, and even if you do, it's a 50-50 roll, it's a 4+ roll. You can't expect too much from it, if I'm honest with you. That's why I don't usually take it. But for me, this one, I'm going to be giving it a 2.5 star rating. So that's the 6 generic powers, all summed up and rated. Now we're going to be talking about the 3 unique Catan powers to the named Catan shards in the elite section of the codex. So we're going to be starting off with the Deceiver with his cosmic insanity. In fact, we did do a video quite recently of why I think the Deceiver is a bit of a hidden gem within the codex. So if you haven't seen that one already, you'll find that one in the playlist, or if I do remember, I'll put a link up in the top corner for you now to click on, and then you can save that to your watch later list. But to briefly go through this Catan power now, we've got one enemy unit within 12 inches and visible to your Deceiver. You roll a d6 and you add the Catan's leadership characteristic to your result. And your opponent then rolls a d6 and adds it to their leadership characteristic. Then the enemy unit will be suffering 1 mortal wound for each point in which the total exceeds your opponent's. So remember, we do play Necrons after all, so we do have a leadership value of a 10, whereas a lot of other factions commonly have a leadership value of a 7 or maybe an 8, and even those weaker ones could even go right down to a leadership value of a 5 or a 6. So you've got high potential of doing a lot of mortal wounds, especially if you roll really high and your opponent rolls really poorly. Bear in mind that neither of these rolls can be re-rolled. So whatever you roll is whatever you get, and it kind of has the desired effect on each kind of unit. If you're going up against a horde unit that's got a leadership value of a 6, for example, you've already got a head start of 4. So even if you roll the equivalent of what your opponent does, you're going to be taking off some mortal wounds for those weaker units. But if you're going up against an elite unit, maybe they've got a leadership value of a 7 or an 8, you're likely going to beat them by a 2 or a 3 on average, so you're going to be removing a single model. And with those elite factions, one single model is actually quite a lot. Now you can further boost this roll by using Flayed Ones or a Psychomancer to lower your opposing unit's actual leadership, especially with Flayed Ones because they're quite usable at the moment with their deep strike ability in particular. As soon as they get close, they're going to be removing leadership from enemy units. That's going to, of course, assist you in throwing extra mortal wounds out there. Now, as for the bad, it requires visibility again. It's only got a short range of 12 inches, and a bad roll likely does nothing, especially against those elite factions. If you're going up against a Space Marine unit that's got a leadership of 8 with the Sergeant, and you roll a 2, they roll a 4, yeah, you've done no damage. But for me, I do quite like the potential of this one, and I would give it a 4-star rating. It's just a shame that the Deceiver doesn't get selected over the other Catan shards, such as the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon. Now speaking of the Nightbringer, he has the Gaze of Death. This is probably my most favourite unique Catan shard power. In fact, it's probably my most favourite out of all of them combined. So you select one enemy unit within 9 inches and visible, you roll 3d6, and for each 4+ roll, the unit suffers D3 mortal wounds. So again, it's got a high potential. In fact, you've got the potential of doing 9 mortal wounds to a single unit, which is pretty powerful, especially if it's a monster, a vehicle, or a character. Bear in mind that the Nightbringer himself is an absolute animal in combat anyway. Potentially be removing a character model in the movement phase with these Catan powers, and then slicing and dicing his way through another vehicle or monster in the fight phase. So yeah, he's an absolute animal. Now, as for the actual roll itself, you do need to roll a 4+, which isn't the best, but you've got 3 attempts at it. So on average, that's 1.5. Now, dice don't work like that, of course. You're either going to roll 1 4-up roll or 2 4-up rolls on average, but you might get lucky and get all 3. And then, as we've already mentioned, this is really good for assassination in particular. You can be throwing this out onto, say, a standard captain. This Catan power alone could literally take the captain off the tabletop. If it doesn't, you've still got the shooting phase to deal with him, or the fight phase, of course, as well. Now, as for the bad, it requires visibility, but to be honest, that 9-inch range, the Nightbringer is out in the open at this stage. He's probably going to make a charge move, so that doesn't really concern me too much. Very similar to the actual range itself being a negative point. I don't care at that stage, he hopefully will be making a charge move. Now, the third point I put here is the dice gods can still mess with you. You can literally fail all 3 of those 4+ rolls, do no damage, or even if you pass all 3 of those 4+ rolls, you could roll a 1 and a couple of 2s and only do 3 mortal wounds overall, which, don't get me wrong, that's not the worst situation, but when you're kind of looking at the max potential of 9 and you only see 3, it's a little bit underwhelming. But for me, I'm going to be giving this one a 4-star rating today. Now we're on to the final one, which is the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon with the Voltaic Storm. So you select an enemy unit within 18 and visible. Now enemy characters with the wounds characteristics of 9 or less cannot be selected for this power while it's within 3 inches of an enemy unit, unless the character is the closest visible enemy unit. You roll a d6, on a 2+, the unit suffers d3 mortal wounds. Now it's going to suffer d6 mortal wounds instead if it has the vehicle keyword. And then until the start of the next turn, if that unit is a vehicle, the characteristics of the vehicle is going to change, then you're simply going to be using half the amount of wounds it's got remaining to determine what characteristics it's going to be using. So if you're unsure what that actually means, let's take a look at our Doomsday Arc, for example. It's got 14 wounds. As soon as it goes down to 7 wounds, it gets bracketed to the tier below, so that actually makes its movement, ballistic skill and attacks go down. And then if it goes down to 3 wounds or less, that movement gets degraded even further, as well as the ballistic skill and the attacks. It's not halving the amount of wounds it actually has, it's just to determine what bracket it is on the damage table. So if it starts with 14 wounds, even if it's still got all 14 wounds, for the purpose of the table, it's going to be considered to have 7, which will actually mean, as an example, our Doomsday Arc will be much slower, will be hitting on a worse ballistic skill and not have as many attacks. So that can be really damaging to a vehicle model. So it's got a decent range of 18 inches, it's very easy to achieve, it's only a 2+ roll. Just like that, you can be throwing out d3 mortal wounds, and it's also really good against vehicles doing d6. Now d6 is a little bit unreliable, don't get me wrong, but it's still better than a d3, isn't it? Now it requires visibility unfortunately, and characters will be protected with a mini lookout Sir bubble unless they're the close enemy model. And to be honest, against non-vehicles it's just okay. Doing just d3 mortal wounds on a 2+ roll is just kind of, yeah, whatever. I'm still going to give it a decent score. I'm going to be giving it a 3.5 out of 5. There's still plenty of vehicles up in the game, and if you're going up against a vehicle heavy list, then yeah. So we come back to the question at the start of the video, are Catan powers overrated? Of course the actual power itself is pretty good, but when you compare a Catan Shard to say a regular Psyker from a different faction, kind of feels like a similar sort of ability to say a smite attack, and when you look at other factions you're paying less than 100 points in some cases to get that Psyker to do those actual powers. So when we're paying 300+ points for our named Catan Shards, it does feel like we're overpaying for them. You just got to remember there's a lot more to our Catan Shards than just the actual Catan powers themselves. All 3 of them have got their own unique tricks, and especially with that Necrodermis ability only being able to lose 3 wounds per phase, means your opponent has to try and target your Catan Shard in as many phases as possible before they actually get slaughtered by it. So your Catan Shard's also going to have a major target on their back, which is very tactical in itself because it means other units within your faction are not going to be targeted as much. But overrated? I don't think so. They're all pretty decent. There are a couple of stinkers in there in my opinion, but really you just shouldn't pick them. You pick the best ones, and against certain factions, they're just really powerful. So guys, that is the end of the video today. Just remember to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.